Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
The world was shocked and saddened last week by the tragedy that was Space Shuttle Challenger. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we're going to talk about the experimental nature of the Space Shuttle program. We're also going to talk about how America is coping with this tragedy, both personally and politically. Our guest today will be Jane Duckworth from the Counseling Psychology Department at Ball State University, Don Klein, who is Director of Corporate Engineering Services at Ball Corporation, and formerly with the Aerospace Division of Ball, and John Rouse from the Department of Political Science at Ball State University. Don Klein, first, tell us about something about the experimental nature as far as Ball Corporation's involvement. Is that it is somewhat of an experiment for Ball Corporation as well?
Our involvement with the Space Shuttle program? I would not call it an experiment as such, no. I believe that our involvement with the Space Shuttle program, as well as with the total aerospace program itself, has been of a very intense nature and not at all experimental. Of course, space in itself, what we are doing is trying to expand the frontiers of space, and in so doing, that is always an experiment by itself. So our involvement is planned, not in that way that you do plan experiments to expand your state-of-the-art, your sphere of knowledge.
So what does Ball Corporation get from this or provide to the shuttle program?
On every shuttle that flies, Ball Corporation, the Aerospace Division, which is located in Boulder, Colorado, the Aerospace Division has what is known as a star tracker and a shuttle actuator, cargo bay actuator. The star tracker is a device that looks at the stars and determines from the star map that it sees, the location of the stars that it sees. They are measured and compared to a star map that has been loaded into a computer memory on the shuttle before launch. And at that time, it compares what it's observing in the celestial space with the predetermined, pre-recorded star map. And when the two overlay exactly, then this information then determines the precise position of the shuttle in space. And that is then fed back to the ground control, which they then put that into the guidance computers and so forth. And by that information, they determine the exact position of the shuttle in space, and they use it for control of the shuttle position as well as its landing as it goes into space.
Don,
it comes down.
I think the question that we all ask is what advantages, what feedback does the space program give us in terms of other kinds of things? In other words, how does it benefit us in other kinds of ways?
What kind of benefits do we get from the space program?
Right.
Well, you know, one of the benefits that we get right away is little pocket calculator. Of course, we can't go anyplace anymore without pocket calculators. And with the fact that we've been able to micro-miniaturize almost the electronic industry, the advances that we've made in the electronic industry. You go to Ball Memorial Hospital, for example, and if you are I guess you could say if you're unfortunate enough to have to go to Ball Hospital, not as a visitor, but as a patient, you go to the hospital, you go into an operating room, or even in the patient care rooms, the way that the electronics, the medical electronics that's in there, the monitoring systems that they have, the surgery, the microsurgery abilities that we have nowadays, and just the techniques that we have, as far as the medical field itself, has really been advanced significantly by the aerospace, by the space program that we've got. in addition to the, not only the medical field itself, but just the world of computers. The computer industry itself has been spawned really by space. And you can go on and on at great lengths.
You were at the Kennedy Center, the launch site, in the days previous to last week's launch, and had witnessed previous launches, but after delay, you came back with your group heading back to Muncie when this launch took place. But had this not, as the entire program, the shuttle program, had it not become a very comfortable part of the space program and of our psyche, that in fact this was an entirely different thing for us, that it was so routine that we were really surprised that anything would go wrong?
Well, I think an indication of how routine it had become was that none of the three main of the three main news networks were carrying the launch live. I believe CNN was the only network that was carrying the launch live. Those of us who have been connected with the space program from the very beginning, from its inception, realize and continually have never lost sight of the fact of the frailty of trying to get everything to work together at one time and in a special sequence so that you can go ahead and launch people into space. You can launch this large rocket. And the extreme care that is taken by the people on the launch crew and by the contractors who make the components and hardware that does go in there, the large amount of testing that is done before anything is ever put together, we don't ever lose sight of that. I think the general public, because we have been had so many successes, and we have been fortunate enough not to have very many failures, that the public has come to accept this and expect it, that, well, here's another launch, it will be a success. And it's unfortunate that, this has been just the public opinion or acceptance of that, when it really is not that easy. It's not that routine.
Gene Duckworth, I was one of the millions who was watching it on television, and certainly a moment I'll never forget. And I guess the impact, the suddenness of it, of the explosion of the Challenger, and even the NASA crews, the ground crews who are monitoring this, a 40-second silence, no one could speak. I suspect that's the sort of thing that's going to stay with everyone's memory.
They'll probably be aware years from now of where they were and what was happening when they first heard about this, just similar to what I'm sure you remember and I do of when President Kennedy was shot. It has that kind of impact, I think, on people. And there's certainly been a lot in the newspapers since then about what do you do about that impact on children who obviously were watching this because of their teacher going in space or because of the teaching involvement in it. Other children were looking at it, I would gather, on that network that you were talking about. And all of a sudden, this isn't a cartoon anymore. This isn't a routine thing. Something terrible happened. I think it's had some good reactions and some bad reactions in the press. I think the good reactions that I have seen is that in some ways it's almost been overkill, like every child is going to be traumatized by seeing something like this. And my impression has been that what seems to affect children the most is their immediacy and how much they know of the person who has been killed. For instance, the children of Krista are going to be much more affected than children who are just watching it as a space project, so to speak. And the other thing is, how do adults handle it around them when they hear that this has happened? Do they fall apart? Well, if they fall apart, obviously to children this is going to be horrible. they feel very unprotected under those circumstances. But the more I think that the adults can kind of acknowledge that this is something that they can handle and that they can talk to children about at some kind of rational way, even though emotionally involved in it, usually helps a child to recognize that death is very much a part of our existence, and we tend, in American society anyway, to ignore death as much as possible. Yeah. We can't under this circumstance.
Yeah, something I'd like to go further into. It was to be an educational experience.
Yes.
A teacher in space was going to beam a live lesson to students throughout the United States via television. The wonders of the electronic media, the technology, was bringing it right live into classrooms. Children had been prepared for weeks because some of their teachers had even applied to become part of this program, and there had to be a lot of expectation. But I suspect, on the other hand, it has to be used as a learning experience that, in fact, teachers really can't say, well, the mission was a failure, therefore there is no lesson to be learned here. They really have to take some positive action, I would think, to make a different kind of lesson of this, don't they?
I would certainly hope so. I hope it isn't ignored in those classrooms in which children were looking at the whole flight sequence. I think the more it's ignored when children have been exposed to it, the more it seems like, oh, that must be so horrible, adults can't talk about it. So the more it's talked about in, as I say, in kind of a rational but realistic way, I think the more it helps children to realize that there will be deaths around them of various kinds. And this is one that they are very much aware of all of a sudden.
Jane, is our society that much different from other societies as far as the issues of death and dying?
I think, I'm going to go out on a limb here because I really don't know that many other societies in comparison except the European societies, and I think they handle death frequently the way we do. It's been my impression from reading about more of the Far Eastern societies and Japan and China and so forth, that they have much more of a at oneness, or at least they seem to, that this is part of a natural cycle. But we've done some interesting things in not calling death death, calling it passing away, for example, or some other things like that. Yeah. With our society living longer, sometimes it's rare for a child to go to a funeral of anybody close to them because Grandma and Grandpa lived to their 80s, say. I know my children, for example, have not been to that many funerals, whereas in the past they might have. You don't see dying people around you. They're in a hospital frequently. I think we're overcoming some of that, but this certainly is a new experience for a lot of children, I'm sure.
19 years ago, the space program lost 3 astronauts, including Indiana's Gus Grissom, in an accident, an on-ground accident. This, however, was on live television. This was before millions of people. I suspect the impact of that immediacy of the technology that provides us television in our living rooms has an impact on the American psyche generally, and not just children.
Yes, I think so. For example, I don't know if you were watching, but I was when Jack Ruby killed
Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Harvey Oswald. And the horror with the idea that somebody was being killed right in front of me. I think that has an impact on anybody who sees that. Now, in this event, I happened to see the pictures at 6 o'clock at night. I had found out about it after it happened, and so was more prepared. And I don't think the impact is ever as great then as it is if you have it, right happening in front of you. So, it's the kind of thing that I'm sure most of us don't want to see happening right in front of us, but when it does, it's much more impactful.
John Rouse, there'll be political fallout from this sort of accident, this sort of horror, this sort of tragedy?
Well, everything is politics, but of course a political scientist would say that, I'm sure. This was a political issue because, ironically, in '84, when Mondale was running against Reagan, Mondale had the support of the National Education Association, and so Reagan, in a sense, trying to respond to the support that Mondale had, said, well, why don't we put a teacher in space? So in a sense, it's sort of mushroomed from that point on. I think as we look at this issue, it's one certainly of nationalism, and it's certainly one of faith and technology. So also it's one, I think, in terms of a civilian control by NASA versus control by the military with the Department of Defense. In terms of comparing it to the Kennedy assassination, I don't think we can make that comparison. I mean, after all, we did not lose the leader of the country. It did have that kind of impact, in a sense, in terms of the personal impact. It had and let me say that the people in the shuttle crew were just as American and democratic as we could ever hope to be. I think that we all felt very close to this group because there was a male, there was male, female, black, white, Japanese American, Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant,
and civilian,
and of course civilian, yeah. So Krista McAuliffe was a person in the sense that any one of us could have taken her place. I mean, she was the first person in the sense of it could have been anyone. So in that sense, I think it was political. In terms of my own reaction to it, I remember as I was coming to campus, I was late coming to campus that particular day, and I tuned into the 11 o'clock news. The big issue in Florida was the failing of the crops because of the cold weather down there. I mean, and so I think we all tended to take this for granted. So we were more interested in the failing crops than the spacewalk. So it is definitely a political issue.
We mentioned Krista McAuliffe's involvement, her death, certainly Jane Duckworth, as every man, every woman. Wasn't she part of us, unlike these astronauts who are in fact pilots, who are different? Wasn't she one of all of us?
She was supposed to be the first civilian who went on. I think thought of...
If you don't count politicians as civilians,
I was wondering
I think that's fair.
I thought we had a senator up there, but he's not a civilian, I guess. I got to thinking, suppose I had applied for that. That would be something I think I might have done just for the sheer excitement of it, and from thinking it was so safe, similar to, I assume most people did, except those really in the know. And think of the people who wanted to go on and weren't chosen. I'm wondering what was going through their minds, how that would be.
And the proposal now for a journalist in space, a writer. Is that sort of thing that could affect the space program, you think, in the long term? In fact, that would this sort of thing discourage people from wanting to become involved?
Well, I would think they'd think twice. And John, wouldn't that get... My impression is that that's kind of the politics. Let's get the human touch in there beyond these highly trained space astronauts and so forth. Let's get the common human being.
Yeah, there's a great deal of controversy now, I guess, in terms of who should go up next.
Whether to do that, yeah.
Now, if it had only professionals, in other words, only astronauts, I think we would have probably said, well, those people do that for a living, and if they die, no big deal in a sense because they choose that profession. But again, this was a very representative crew of Americans, and I think we all identified with those people.
What I had wondered is if this had happened in the previous shuttle flight, which had all kinds of problems getting up, and then they wanted to bring them back early, and they couldn't, and they had odds and ends of difficulties. But I think if the explosion had happened then, there wouldn't have been quite the impact of, oh my gosh, what's happened here, with this person who could have been any of us, really, to be there. It is a different, I think, to people.
Yeah, I agree.
Don Klein, is this an argument for slowing down the space program? Is this an argument for not having manned space flights, for letting computers and equipment do the job rather than human beings?
No, I don't believe it's an argument for slowing down at all. I think that the reason these people, astronauts and the general public, the people from the public who want to go, For example, if I had a chance to go, I would go. I believe that it is safe. It's certainly a lot safer than driving your car home tonight, if you look at percentages and averages. And I believe that these people, they're explorers. They want to push the frontiers of our knowledge. It's no different than it was several hundred years ago when we were trying to find what was at the edge of the ocean. How many seamen lost their lives, you know, and general public lost their lives in shipwrecks and so forth as they were coming to the New World. How about the westward ho? You know, when you started out with the Davy Crockett's and the frontiersmen, you know, which could be likened to the professional astronaut. And then you had the people coming in wagon trains, and they were the general public at that time that were continuing to push the exploration and the frontiers. And I believe that's what's happening now. We're just at that changeover. We're approaching that changeover when we will not have, where in addition to the professionals, we should bring in additional people, general public, to help expand the frontiers. I think that if we were to consider stopping or slowing down the space program, the space exploration program that we have, and the development programs that we have going on right now, would really be a, for lack of a better word, a disservice to the astronauts who did make the supreme sacrifice, you know, just the other day. They were doing that knowing what they were doing, that they were wanting to push the frontiers of science and technology as far as the world was concerned, in the United States specifically. And that if we don't continue, those people, they were willing to give their lives so that this kind of activity could continue. And I think that we owe that to them to continue. And I think they would, if they're somewhere looking down on what's going on, if we did not continue, I think they would feel that they made the sacrifice in vain.
How important is it that there are, in fact, human beings on board a mission like this, as opposed to machines or animals to test the effects on the physiology?
I believe, I'm not sure if it was Gene Cernan, who was an astronaut, or John Glenn made the comment that you can do certain types of exploration and experimentation with robots and animals and you know, computers and things of that nature. But when you get to make the final decisions, and you need the human in there and their logic, on-the-spot logic capability. And I think that you have to have the human being involved in that.
Don, so you're saying that this failure should not diminish our faith in technology, so to speak?
Definitely not. This failure is when they finally discover what it was and everything, I think it will probably be a one of a kind. And it's not a generic thing that the whole program is in jeopardy or anything like that.
My own impression is that it points out how good the technology has been up until this point in time. I mean, it's amazing that they've been able to do what they've been able to do, considering the risks that I think I was downplaying were even there. And now we know they were there all the time, and they still had everything working right. It is amazing to me that such a thing can be happening.
Yeah.
Will we recover? Will the space program, Jane Duckworth, have, in fact, the full support of the American people, or has this diminished forever, perhaps, a little bit of the confidence in this program?
I would think that would only happen if it happens again right away. But everybody I've talked to and my own feelings are, you know, this was one of the risks that happened. And I haven't talked with anybody who seems to say we ought to pull out immediately. That just hasn't been, in any sense, what I've read about, what I've talked to other people about, and what I've personally felt.
I think the general feeling amongst the people that I've talked to and that I've read in the papers and so forth is that the population is saying we should continue. This is just, you know, it's not a setback, it's a sidestep more or less as opposed to a setback, and that we need to continue on. I think the general population is in agreement with continuing.
Don, is it possible then that this will become a boon or a big focus for support of the space program. It certainly would not have had the publicity without this kind of thing.
I think it'll just focus more, cause the program to be focused more, and they will get in and re-examine where they are. I don't know that it's going to add any extra push to it. I think it certainly brings it back into focus again, but I think it will continue on. I don't believe it'll have any negative or any great positive effects to it.
Yeah, obviously a political question in terms of funding, and the line from The Right Stuff, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. You're talking about a $2 billion spacecraft here. I mean, this is not nothing at the drop of the hat. I guess maybe you compare it to the federal budget, perhaps, but $2 billion is a lot of money. Yeah. Is Congress going to be so willing to turn around and say certainly more money for NASA?
Well, it certainly seems so, Larry. Of course, it's a matter of what we do with our priorities, but it would certainly seem so. We're talking about the president's speech this week. We need to cut back here. We need to cut back here in social programs, in welfare. Is that somewhat of a contradiction? Yeah. Well, certainly,
human programs we're talking about cutting back on?
It's a contradiction, but of course the president is not talking about cutting back on. He wants to cut back on other politicians' programs and not, of course, his own. And, of course, NASA has received a great deal of support from the administration.
Well, is NASA a Ronald Reagan type of program? Is it not?
I think so. I think more than anything, this is a focus upon nationalism. It is the one issue that rallies all Americans. It's a patriotic kind of issue. It's a issue that we all can identify with, and I think from that point of view, it's going to have support.
Okay. Any final comments?
I think that's a good closing.
I just hope we don't have to do this again at any close period of time. So,
well, I think that in terms of final comments, we want to keep this from a civilian point of view in terms of NASA as opposed to a military point of view. We also want to keep it as democratic as possible in terms of including as many groups as possible.
Okay, we're out of time. Thanks to our guests, Don Klein from Ball Corporation, Jane Duckworth from Counseling Psychology, and John Rouse from Political Science. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.